Welcome to a special edition of KenFM in Gespräch. Our guest today is Mr. Richard Gage. Welcome, Mr. Gage.
Thank you, Tommy.
Thank you.
Nice
yes, and we might as well say Richard and Tommy because we already know each other, and I think we agree upon that.
Indeed, and thank you for introducing me the other night.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm very happy to have you here in Berlin, and I'm very happy to get to know you. I've been following your work for many years now in the Architects and Engineers of 9/11 Truth, where you are the founder and the chairman nowadays. And Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, then we already, so to speak, we know what it's what it's about. The 9/11 questions regarding the so-called terror attacks on 9/11. Could you briefly tell us about your life before 9/11? I mean, on September 11th, what was your professional life? What was it like? Did you have any? What were your plans for the future, for your career as an architect?
I had been working for 20 years at the time as an architect on several different types of construction, library, animal rescue centers, high schools, city hall, and a large commercial project with 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing in Summerlin, Nevada. So I was looking forward, I think, to the acceleration of that career, very large projects I was getting into, when I found out about 9/11, which just turned my life around. I realized as I was listening to the radio that in May of 2002, that nothing was going to be the same after this, because I had this horrible feeling in my gut as I heard David Ray Griffin talking about all of this evidence on the radio. I had to pull my car over, just in shock about what I was hearing, about explosions that were documented in oral histories by the first responders, that David Ray Griffin was being interviewed in this radio station in Berkeley. And Graham McQueen, another researcher, had put together that 118 of these 500 orally recorded first responders had heard sounds of explosions and seen flashes of light at the onset of this 12-second destruction for each of the Twin Towers, shattering the structure from top to bottom. I didn't hear about this. I thought this was a gravitational collapse by weakening by fire and jet plane impacts. And then I heard there was a third skyscraper that came down that afternoon. And what is going on here? It's like the Twilight Zone. My whole world just started rocking, tilting, conflicting with the information that I thought was sure, as our government and agencies and the media had told us about these events. So it changed things significantly. I realized I can't just go on and ignore what I heard. I have to tell other people about this. And I found out that most of them didn't want to know about it or hear about it, because they, like me initially, thought that this would just be in the realm of conspiracy theory. But I go, wait, we're talking about facts. So I put these facts together and I presented them to the firm that I was working with at the time. All 15 architects and engineers showed up at the lunch where I presented them pizza. I fed them pizza, and I fed them the information that I had gathered from Stephen Jones's, a researcher on the subject of 9/11, and his PowerPoint I had put together. I stole it and I reformatted it.
How did they react?
All of them, after the presentation, agreed with me that these are controlled demolitions. And 14 out of 15 signed my petition right there on the spot.
Yeah, okay.
So instead of one architect and engineer for 9/11 Truth, I now had 14. My boss was Middle Eastern, so he didn't feel comfortable signing the petition. So yes, that launched a whole different lifestyle, because then from that point on, I was teaching people, traveling around the country, and eventually going to foreign countries to present this information.
Yeah.
Now we've been to 35 foreign countries, 82 American cities, 2,300 architects and engineers signed on to the petition, and we're making great headway.
And now you're making a tour in Europe. I think you're ending up in Hungary, in Ungarn.
Budapest.
Budapest, yeah, genau. And I'd like to get back to the oral histories you talked about, because one could read about these testimonies in the 9/11 Commission report. I would like to read these oral histories to understand what went wrong that day.
Yeah, but you won't find them there.
How come?
You won't even find the destruction of World Trade Center Building 7, the third worst structural failure, in the 9/11 Commission report, which was supposed to explain the whole series of events to people.
So they just disregarded the Building 7, or how should I understand that?
Yeah. I mean, here's the third worst structural failure in modern history. A 47-story skyscraper that collapses in just under 7 seconds, symmetrically, at free fall, with evidence of molten iron in the basements, hot temperature corrosion attacks by sulfur, which is evidence of something we need to be looking at here. And yet didn't even mention it. And that's real indicative of something.
But have you ever addressed any of the 9/11 Commission members about the issues? Have you asked them, or do you know anything about their point of view on the matter?
Well, no, I haven't personally had the opportunity to address the commissioners, but they've let their feelings be known on this subject. In fact, one of them, Max Cleland, resigns from the commission, citing that it's a national scandal. Others say we were astonished at the lies we were hearing. They called them untruths from the Bush administration, and they said they were set up to fail. In fact, the 9/11 Commission attorney, John Farmer, himself, in his book, says that there was a decision not to tell the American people the truth, that almost everything that they had written was inexplicably untrue.
Yeah.
This is extraordinary.
Yeah.
And part of which was the lack of exposure for the explosions that were heard from these 118 first responders at the initiation of collapse of the World Trade Center, and the flashes of light they were seeing at that initiation also.
Yeah, which indicates explosives.
Clearly.
Yeah, yeah. In your daily work, so to speak, how did you manage this transfer from being a, should we say, a normal architect with normal ambitions, and then all of a sudden you have to go into this way where there's almost a point of no return, and you also have to make a living. How did you manage to in the first years at all to make ends meet?
Well, for at least a couple of years, I think it was 4 years, I was working full-time as an architect, and at night I was putting together this PowerPoint, and during the weekend I was doing traveling, and then during the week I would take off from work and on my vacation time and travel and teach people about these towers, because the evidence was mostly all there. All I had to do was assemble it into a presentable, understandable picture and bring it to people. And then when they saw that, they almost all agreed. In fact, we take a show of hands at the beginning of the presentation. How many agree with the official story? How many are unsure? How many already agree with are aware of and in agreement with the evidence for controlled demolition in these buildings? And we take us the same poll afterwards, and almost everybody in the audience ends up agreeing with us. The evidence is very, very clear.
In your opinion, could you point out sort of the most hard evidence, in your opinion, of the controlled demolition? Is that the Building 7 or the Twin Towers?
Well, it's certainly both. And we start with Building 7 because theoretically no one died in that building. I mean, according to the official story. And most people don't even know anything about it. So they're learning something new. So the level of open-mindedness is much better. So we begin with Building 7, and indeed it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. And so that's what they end up agreeing with, because it's in their frame of reference. Unlike the Twin Towers, which we have emotional trauma associated with those, because we were fed those destructive images and loss of life, catastrophic attack on America. So we're in a state of shock and awe, really, reducing us to kind of an infantile mindset during that day particularly. And then we're told that this is a gravitational collapse due to structural weakening by fire. And yet it's anything but that. It's clearly, in the first 4 seconds, an implosion of the top story. And then after 4 seconds, a very explosive event where 4-ton structural steel sections are hurled laterally, landing up to 200 meters in every direction, 90 kilometers per hour. And the evidence goes on and on. So, but if we start with Building 7, which we have a much better success rate of getting people in the door, and they're almost universally agreeing, yeah, I've seen controlled demolitions on TV, this has to be that. What's next? And they're trembling inside about what they know is coming next, which is the Twin Towers. But in Building 7, it was very well documented by FEMA.
The Federal Emergency Management
Association.
Agency. Yeah,
and agency.
Agency, yeah.
And they have, they had a 2002 report, and the whole Appendix C is dedicated to this scientific forensic examination of the steel, which shows that it had a molten iron attack and hot sulfur corrosion attack, pieces that look like Swiss cheese. And the author, Jonathan Barnett, cites that the ends of the beams were partially evaporated.
Did the FEMA explain this phenomenon?
No, they have no idea. In fact, the New York Times calls it the biggest mystery in World Trade Center.
But then, of course, it was all solved with the NIST report, with the first NIST report, wasn't it?
Not exactly. The NIST report eliminated this forensic examination of the steel, and there's no mention of the beams that were partially evaporated, even though these were very, very well documented. Of course, jet fuel and office fires can't get to be even a third of the temperature it takes to melt steel, or much less evaporate steel, which we're talking 2,000 degrees Celsius, probably 1,500 degrees Celsius to melt it. So where did those temperatures come from? Well, molten iron, which they did document, is the byproduct of thermite. Thermite is an incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. So here we have the evidence from official sources of the use of thermite, and yet and thermate, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, and sulfur is found and documented as well, with no reasonable speculation even on the part of officials as to where the sulfur came from.
Okay, I'll have to get this right, because you're telling me that the FEMA documented this molten iron or molten steel, and also indicating very clearly that there were explosives, and then
incendiaries.
Yeah, and then NIST just pretended that it wasn't there. Is that the
Well,
fact?
yes, they pretended it wasn't there by eliminating that forensic examination from their final report, as well as the hundreds of witnesses of explosions.
That's not a scientific procedure.
What?
To eliminate known data.
Yes, the scientific method says look at all the data. In fact, look at the hypotheses with objective intent, and don't eliminate any of them until the data eliminates them.
Yeah.
We don't use our preconceived conceptions or our agenda to eliminate potential hypotheses such as controlled demolition, particularly since no high-rise has ever come down due to fire, which is the cause of all 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. And every high-rise that has come down has been due to controlled demolition, and they all look like controlled demolitions of some sort.
Yeah. But now we have, in history, we now have 3 cases of high-rises allegedly being brought down by fire. Why don't we have any general warnings in these kinds of buildings to the general people, to the general population, that please be careful with the matches. This building can collapse without notice.
It is a problem. In fact, NIST did make some recommendations for structural changes in high-rises, and to date, none of them have been incorporated into the International Building Code. They know that their buildings are safe, and they may or may not know that there's another reason for them having come down on 9/11. Perhaps they know, and because of that, they're not going through the process, as NIST recommended, of incorporating these changes, because it's a significant expense in the cost of these buildings.
Yeah, sure. I also I find it a little bit strange that we haven't seen a worldwide 9/11 upgrade industry serving these high-rises so that they could get to a more secure level. But apparently there has been no such incident.
No, there have been some increases in the egress codes. There have been some increases in the level of fire protection, but nothing structurally, nothing that would keep a high-rise building from falling at free fall acceleration due to a few small office fires, such as the 47-story Building 7.
Yeah. Could you please try to explain the official story about the Building 7 and this part about the it's wide as a football field and 47 stories high, falling with free fall acceleration. Specifically, the part about the columns.
Yeah.
How do they explain this collapse?
Well, the hypothesis that they zoomed in on was the initiation of collapse by thermal expansion due to normal office fires. And there were fires in Building 7. They were few and small and scattered. And again, fires have never brought down a skyscraper. So we have a very creative hypothesis of the destruction by normal office fires, and that is that these, what they call raging fires, caused a thermal expansion of these beams, steel beams, on the 13th floor. Now, the fires weren't raging. In fact, they were few, small, and scattered. They were out over an hour before the building came down at 5:20 in the afternoon. And that's proven by the photos and videos that are available of. So they couldn't possibly, in the first place, have been causing the expansion of these beams at the time of collapse. So nevertheless, well, they couldn't also, even if they were there, they couldn't have caused the expansion of these beams because these beams are fireproofed. There's not enough fuel in an office building to cause the expansion of beams, particularly given the insulation of the modern fireproofing was built in the mid-'80s. So, but what they did to try to prove that these beams expanded is in their computer model, they heated it up to within 2 seconds. 2 seconds, the beams are heated up And so they forced them to expand instead of sag, which is what they would have done, and what the fire tests proved that they would have done rather than expand laterally. But in the process, they don't heat the concrete slab up above these beams, so they force the shear studs, or the pins that connect those two elements of the composite system, to break. The shear studs are broken in their computer model that way.
But surely a fire would have affected both the steel frames and the ceiling.
And over a long period of time,
sure.
like 20 minutes is all the fuel there is in any given area to burn. So they force this beam to expand, and then these beams land on a girder. And this heavy girder is said to have been pushed off of its seat on this column 79. So, but that couldn't have happened because the shop drawings show that there were indeed shear studs or pins tying this girder vertically into the concrete slab above it. So it could not have slid sideways at all.
No.
But even if that could have happened, it would have had to have been pushed 12 inches, not 6 inches, to fall off of its 12-inch wide seat on that column 79. And the reason is because the ends of that girder had steel stiffeners, which NIST had omitted from their model, saying that the flange at the end of the girder then folded, so it only had to be pushed off half of its seat. So that couldn't have happened because that's fraudulent, the omission of key structural elements that would violate or pull the rug out from underneath their entire theory. But even if that girder could have pushed 12 inches off of its seat, the floor 13 wouldn't have fallen on 12 and caused a progressive collapse.
And I mean, we are talking about a collapse that affected the whole building and not only this one corner.
Well, there are three other girders framed into that building which would hold that floor up.
Yeah, and they don't even claim that they have been marked by fire, these other girders.
No, the fire was in this other quarter with these beams in this first
Exactly.
girder. So, according to the official story. Even if those girders weren't there, the floor might have touched, 13 floor might have touched 12, but it couldn't have caused a progressive collapse. But even if that could have occurred, we would have had massive deformation as this progressive collapse ensued in the exterior perimeter structural steel system, and breaking of granite panels and windows all over the place, because this instability, they say, traveled vertically up through the system, and their computer model shows 400 structural steel connections failing every second, which is an astronomical rate of failure that's not even natural.
So that means that the collapse that we saw on 9/11, the Building 7, if this collapse is described in a computer model, it contained 400, what did you say, 400?
Structural steel connections are failing every second.
Every second.
Of the 7-second collapse.
Do they?
Well, excuse me, the 30-second collapse overall, as NIST describes this interior collapse, gutting the building, and then the exterior somehow just then falls.
But that amount of destruction would require, I should think, a lot of energy. Do they address the issue? How did this occur? How could this be connected to office fires?
Well, yes, this series of instabilities, they say, started by the thermal expansion, pushing this girder off of its seat, and then a progressive floor collapse, leaving this column 79 unbraced for 9 floors. Then it finally buckles, causing this interior collapse, which goes vertically and then travels laterally through the rest of the building, somehow leaving the perimeter intact and unmolested and undeformed, which is completely impossible. It would have pulled in the walls, the building would have been tipping over.
Clearly. Also, they are talking about, we could call it a chain reaction, but this is not a chain reaction, this is a symmetric reaction at one time, the whole building. According
to the videos, the east penthouse drops a few seconds before, but there's no internal cascading failure. You would see light through the windows, you'd see deformation up there. So there was some sort of a collapse of the east penthouse presumably explosives going off at the wrong time. And then in the final 7 seconds, the entire building, like you said, an acre in size, 40,000 tons of structural steel, 5 times stronger than it needed to be, drops suddenly, straight down, symmetrically, and at free fall acceleration. In other words, it's getting faster and faster and faster, just like this object, 3, 2, 1. No resistance. Straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, all those structural columns. So this pen can drop because there's no resistance, but a building has lots of resistance, as David Chandler, the physicist, says, or physics teacher, says that that's why we feel comfortable going into a building, because it has resistance.
Right, right. I learned in school many years ago, if I remember correctly, that energy would always choose the path with the less resistance. But energy hasn't done so in this case.
Well, there's some other massive amount of energy at work to remove all 80 columns in this building at once, which is what's required for it not to tip over. Mm-hmm. Any deviation in that pattern, and this building is going to begin to tip over.
Yeah.
But it goes straight down, indicating a very precise removal of all 80 columns within a fraction of a second. So the question I put to the Urania attendees last night is, can fire accomplish that level of precision? So it comes down to that question, and if your rational mind says, no, fire is an organic, natural process, it's not going to accomplish that level of precision, then you have a problem. And the problem is that means controlled demolition, which is how they remove columns with precision, with explosives, or thermite incendiaries, in this case, for which we have the evidence of the byproduct of thermite molten iron. So once we come to that answer, we're sent on the big problem. We're set onto the big problem.
That's the point of no return.
Yeah, the point of no return, because you're acknowledging that A, this is a controlled demolition. B, we were told this was normal office fires. C, we've been lied to. D, if we were lied to about Building 7, then we must squarely, fearlessly look at the evidence at the World Trade Center. So then we started the audience on that path. And I think 100% of them were shocked to find out that indeed we have very solid evidence there as well. And of course that sets us on the next point of no return. What does all of this mean? And it's scary, because that means Al-Qaeda probably is not the culprit here. They didn't have access to 3 of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. Probably. We can all speculate that at least. And so who did? You know, who had access to some very sophisticated thermitic materials? Who had access to the buildings? We're talking about, the security company that needs to be investigated. We're talking about Ace Elevator, who came out of nowhere to secure the elevator modernization contract, the biggest one in the world.
That was built by Otis.
Even though Otis built the elevators and was maintaining them, here's Ace Elevator coming in and going out of business immediately after 9/11, taking this 9-month elevator modernization, which would have given them access to the core columns and beams in the building. Yeah. So we certainly want an investigation of them and a security company.
That was specifically the Twin Towers, this elevator modernization, If you look at the 2 or the 3 collapses on 9/11, at least I see a remarkable difference. Normally, I've read somewhere that when you make a controlled demolition, the pile after the collapse will be between 10 and 14% of the original height, something like that. And that goes quite well with the dimensions of the Building 7. But when we look at the Twin Towers, they were 400 meters high. Where are those two 40 meters high piles of rubble that should be lying there? I mean, all the pancakes. I mean, we're told that these 110 floors were collapsing in a pancake style, which means there should be a lot of pancakes visible, but apparently it's all gone. Where's the concrete gone?
Yeah, it is pretty much all gone. There's only a 2-story pile of core columns, perimeter columns, other miscellaneous metals underneath the two, where the two Twin Towers were. And so we're looking for 110 floors of 4-inch thick concrete, and a dozen of which were 8-inch thick.
Yeah, the reinforced floors.
4-inch thick is 8-10 centimeters,
yeah.
And twice that for the mechanical floors. So what we see in the videos, all of them, is not a pile driver, a 15-story pile driver in the case of the North Tower, above the point of jet plane impacts. Mm-hmm. It's not driving the rest of the building down, as we're told. Basically, that's the theory, this massive weight. It is destroyed in the first 4 seconds, and very similar to Building 7, really a classic implosion. It doesn't go down like this, it goes like this. Yeah. Its structure is basically liquefied. One column from another beam, all completely severed. After that, just like the firemen described, like a belt, all these explosions, in which you see in the videos, 4-ton structural steel sections hurled laterally at 90 kilometers per hour, landing 200 meters in every direction up to that far, and trailed by thick clouds of smoke, which is the most interesting thing about those. And
what does that indicate, in your opinion?
Well, we have molten iron at the base of all towers. We have the USGS finding the signature, a signature element in the World Trade Center dust in their toxicological studies, along with R.J. Lee, an environmental firm, documenting these billions of previously molten iron microspheres, the diameter of a human hair. And this is elemental iron they're finding. So where does molten iron come from? Incendiaries. So if the ends of these beams are attacked with a thermite, we would expect iron oxide to be trailing off these laterally flying structural steel elements. Yeah. And that's what we see, but also we see where this concrete goes, in mid-air you can see the massive pulverization of concrete. It's not down at the bottom of the pile, so it had to go somewhere else. What we see is that 90,000 tons of concrete is being pulverized in mid-air to a fine powder, which is laid throughout Lower Manhattan, river to river, in 20 centimeter thick blanket or so.
Yeah, yeah. We're told that as you say, that's a normal collapse when concrete is pulverized, but we don't need to believe that. But I would like you to judge what could cause this massive destruction. What could have caused it, do you think, in your opinion? Yeah. Jet fuel, certainly not.
No, jet fuel is basically kerosene. It doesn't burn hot. In fact, the manufacturer says it only burns at about 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 300 Celsius. So where did all this heat exceeding 1500 Celsius come from? Thermite produces molten iron at 4,000 or 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 2,000 degrees Celsius. So it's a very likely suspect. What could pulverize concrete? We're probably talking also high energy explosives, perhaps C4 or RDX, or perhaps
conventional explosives.
It could be that, or it could be a very high-tech form of nanothermite, a very high-tech form of thermite called nanothermite, which appears to have been placed in layers and has more explosive properties because the aluminum platelets and iron oxide crystals inside of these small red-gray chips, documented by a small team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen, are found in all 4 independently collected samples and documented in a peer-reviewed paper. Well, this is basically thermite, and but it's a very, because of the small size at the nanoscale of these particles, they can ignite very rapidly and become even more explosive, particularly since they're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon.
And do we know for a fact that these chips are actually built from an atomic level in a lab? Do we know that for a fact?
That's what the paper has determined from Niels Harrit, Stephen Jones, Jeff Farr, and these other scientists. These are world-class scientists. And this paper has not been challenged in a peer-reviewed sense, which is how you challenge somebody's peer-reviewed paper.
2009 it came out and hasn't been challenged since. I'd like to get back to the overall event, because as we've already discussed, you when you look at 9/11, you reach a point quite soon where you actually have to go on. You can't go back. You can't make this. It really happened, and we need to address this. But you have been looking specifically as an organization at the Building 7 and the Twin Towers. Do you have any takes on the destructions in Pentagon, for instance, or have you left that for other parties?
Well, there are other parties who focus on that, and guess what? They have lots of disagreement.
Yeah.
But, which is one of the reasons we don't focus on it, because there's a lack of information, there's a lot of misinformation, and there's disinformation and acrimony. But what we all do agree on is that nothing should have hit the Pentagon, with the most highly defended building in the world with surface-to-air missiles. And the high-resolution videos, which would show exactly what did or didn't hit the Pentagon, would have not been released. So there's obviously a cover-up of some sort going on at the Pentagon. We all agree that Hani Hanjour, the pilot who we're told was flying this airliner into the Pentagon, failed Cessna flying school and should not have been able to perform a 270-degree corkscrew dropping flight pattern, dropping 3,000 feet per minute, which is more indicative of what a fighter jet's capable of. And of course landing in the area of civilians and military that were looking for the missing money in the Pentagon budget that Donald Rumsfeld had announced, actually $2.3 trillion.
You'll have to elaborate that one. Rumsfeld said what on the day
There was a
before
public
9/11?
announcement among his other announcements that he was making the day before 9/11 that they're missing up to $2.3 trillion in the Pentagon budget, in the Pentagon expenses. They can't account for it.
Yes, okay, yeah. It was money that was already spent, that was used, but they couldn't account for it.
Well, it was lost.
Yeah,
we
lost.
don't know if it was actually used or how it was used,
If I remember correctly, he even declared a war against this
that's
tyranny or against this situation, But
he got his war the next day.
He got his war the next
and
day.
I doubt that they spent much time looking for that money.
Yeah.
So that would have given, for instance, an infinite amount of money, relatively, to have perpetrate the series of events in the Twin Towers that, of course, would be extremely expensive. Thermite cutter charges are very expensive, which is why they're not used normally in the controlled demolition industry. But there were patented devices that can issue, in hundreds of milliseconds, molten iron through structural steel. Very efficient.
Who makes this stuff? Who makes this stuff in?
Well, we don't know who makes nanothermite. There's plenty of firms that make regular thermite. You can actually get it on eBay. It's just iron oxide, which is rust, and aluminum powder. But the fine form of this at the nanoscale is a whole nother animal. There's probably few companies that would be responsible for making that. So we have a target for an investigation right there.
But it's not something that any ordinary terrorist potential group would be able to buy at the grocery. It's really high tech stuff.
Yeah, and it's not made in a cave in Afghanistan either.
Okay, now, do you know anything about what happened to the Building 6?
Yeah, Building 6 is a fascinating case study because there's molten iron found in Building 6 too, indicating that we have thermite charges going off. We have the elevator cores, or several of the cores of the building missing, and an apparent interior controlled demolition of parts of this building as well. We have molten concrete, which is 1,500 degrees centigrade or so. Concrete temperatures flowing, in fact, wrapping around police guns, the chunks of which, with the guns sticking out of it, are now in the police museum in New York, a testament to the extreme temperatures that the official story can't even account for.
Yeah, yeah. The Building 6 was also, as I recall, it was there was the largest gold deposit outside of the Fort Knox. Under Building 6, and that was the Building 6 that the photographer Kurt Sonnenberg photographed and documented, and the reason why he is now in South America in hiding. But if you look at the World Trade Center and look at the amount of destructions, it strikes me that the Building 6 is equipped with a crater in the middle of the building where everything's totally disappeared. And if you look at the building, I think it's Building 4 or 5, it's all surrounded in flames, totally a very huge, very aggressive fire, but the building stands afterwards.
Building 5.
Why these differences?
Yeah, good question. There was a very, very hot, large fire that engulfed Building 5. Another steel frame, mid-rise in this case, building, and it didn't come down. So it's a testimony to the history of very hot, large fires in high-rise buildings that have never brought one down. And yet the few small scattered fires in Building 7 brought that entire massive building down in 7 seconds. It just can't happen. Relative to Building 6, it appears that we have a controlled demolition of interior portions only. Perhaps the whole thing was supposed to come down. We don't know. Maybe there's a series of explosive charges that didn't go off there. I don't know.
Yeah. Are you aware that in the second, when the second tower collapses, just before that, you could actually see smoke developing from Building 6. So, which
Down
indicates,
low?
which indicates that it was made before the collapse.
Yeah, the collapse of either tower. There's smoke and down low outside of Building 6.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So something was going on at street level or even lower.
This white smoke coming out of Building 6 at the street level before the collapse of either tower could be indicative of aluminum oxide, a gas that is another byproduct of thermite.
Again, explosives.
Incendiaries in this case.
Yeah,
Some people
yeah.
use the term explosives, but there's a keen difference. Incendiaries work by heat, massive heat, so they melt stuff. They start fires. Explosive work by pressure, moving objects by pressure due to the organic material in the explosives.
Yeah. People often ask me when they doubt the controlled demolition theory, they say, but we don't hear any explosions. We don't see any explosions or hear them in television. And if you look at all the clips from the collapses, there are actually only a few where you can also audible hear the explosions. But the main versions of what has been shown is we don't hear any explosions, and that's why it's very hard to make people believe in the stuff.
Well, there's two things going on here. First of all, we're talking mostly about thermite, probably, which doesn't have loud bangs or bright flashes like high-energy explosives like C4 and RDX. So we're not going to hear the bangs people are expecting with controlled demolitions. Second of all, they're synchronistically timed, thousands of them, to create more of a roar than bang, bang, bang. Mm-hmm. And yet we still do have dozens of witnesses who are talking about that exactly. Bang, bang, bang. So they certainly heard it and experienced it, even though the cameras have less of such evidence.
But do you think the camera mics didn't work on that day, or?
Well, I don't know what camera mics are capable of. I'm just referring to witnesses, professional first responders who were there, actually 118 of them, talking about bangs and explosions and seeing flashes of light.
These testimonies, where are they? Are they at the Congressional Library, or where can one find them?
We just Google 118 firefighters, sounds of explosions. It's on the Journal of 9/11 Studies, this particular report by Graham McQueen. Mm-hmm. Journal of 9/11studies.com.
Yeah, okay. Throughout the years, do you feel any development? Where are we headed? Is this still an uphill job, or?
Apparently,
yeah.
We're pushing a big rock up a big hill, mm-hmm. And the hill has to do with censorship on the part of the media, silence on the part of the government about the truth of this evidence, and denial on the part of the American people, who are not wanting to look or to go back to a place of pain inside of ourselves that was induced that morning. Shock, awe, trauma. So we formulated an answer to that painful morning, and it was largely what we were told by the media, that we had 19 fundamentalist jackers hijack planes, run them into buildings. We have a gravitational collapse due to fire and weakening of structural steel. So that is a very convenient place to set this traumatic episode aside and move on. And to get people to look back at it is extremely difficult. But there are more and more people who are responding. There's more and more media exposure, thanks to courageous journalists like yourself, and some in the mainstream media, like Geraldo Rivera, who showed Building 7 coming down, like C-SPAN, who gave us 45 minutes on their TV program, Washington Journal, to reach 3 million people, and also showed Building 7 coming down. And me representing 2,300 architects and engineers, not conspiracy theorists, but technical and building professionals. Mm-hmm. So this is all helpful, and having over the last 8 years developed a point of credibility in which we're used by millions of those in the 9/11 Truth Movement to convey to others that there's reality to this evidence, and that the evidence implies something very different than what we were led to believe on that fateful morning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mr. Gage, I would like to thank you very much for coming. I would look forward to see you the next time in Berlin or wherever. This was a special edition of KenFM in Gespräch. My name is Tommy Hansen, and I am addressing the people.
KenFM.de